Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
So, we're on episode 11 of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. And the topic today is the evolution of Buddhist practices.
That's right. So this is one of the topics that was requested online. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about how various practices have come about, changed from country to country and throughout history, and perhaps maybe also how they'll be changing into the future.
Yeah, so if any of you would like to request a topic, just send us a message or leave us a comment and we'll try to address that.
So I suppose we should start at the beginning, and I think especially from the Western standpoint, there's a lot of questioning about ritual practices or ceremonies and things of this nature, and when they came about, and whether or not they're necessary or required for Buddhist practice. And I think part of that movement has been to go back to some kind of original idea of what Buddhism was before there was a ceremonial component to Buddhist practices. So I think in my own research and analysis, many of these things probably started the moment the Buddha passed away. So there were ceremonies marking his death, the cremation, the disbursement of the relics throughout India and what's now Nepal and these areas. So I don't know if we can ever say that there was a time when there wasn't maybe a ceremonial component to the Buddhist teaching, or where these practices weren't kind of part of what we call Buddhism today.
And I think that's very true because even when the Buddha was alive, bringing it back even further, the process of requesting the teachings was very ceremonial as well, with offerings being made and then a formal request for the Dharma.
That's true. So even in the Buddha's larger lectures, there was a formal manner for the monks to be arranged. The way the requester would come before the Buddha, bow to request the teaching. There was always, even documented in the suttas, a formalized manner of requesting and interacting with the teacher and the lecturer.
Mm-hmm. And I think, to some extent, that sort of tradition persists to the modern day in various Buddhist schools, and it looks a lot different depending on the school of Buddhism we're talking about, between Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism. But ultimately, that sort of core idea, the origin is the same, and how these practices manifest now are a lot different because of evolution through time.
That's true. So I think in the Chinese tradition, you may even see people holding the stick of incense, circumnavigating the lecturer, making a formal request for the Dharma. And I think a lot of other schools don't have it as formal, but that's still done, and you can see it in temples, even in the United States. In the Japanese tradition, there's a lot of requests. Sometimes they're done as announcements before services. So you'll see sometimes a person take out a scroll, read the announcement formally of what the service is for, requesting making the request to particular people, both living and deceased, for their continued support and practice. And so that type of aspect of this formal practice still exists.
Mm-hmm. And looking at other practices, I think the practice that is very much common to all schools of Buddhism is meditation, but then within that there's a lot of variation in meditation, and I think a lot of developments in how people meditate in different cultures and different regions.
That's true. So the meditation practice most widely known probably in the West is Vipassana, so sort of silent sitting meditation, adapted from the Theravada tradition. But what it lacks, I think, is what I've practiced myself in Theravada temples, is the chanting in Pali and those other practices that usually go along with the meditation practice. And then from country to country, I think you'll see a wide development and differentiation of the type of meditation practice that's done. So if we just, for example, briefly compare Shingon and Tibetan Buddhism, the example I usually give is that Shingon is very close to the original transmission from China to Japan, whereas Tibet had a long and very rich tradition of developing commentaries, a lot of commentarial literature within the country. And so a lot of practice is based on later commentaries and practice manuals that were developed from those original practices.
And I think even in Japan, there's a lot of novel practices that didn't really have necessarily a basis in Buddhism before reaching China and Japan. For example, things like the tea ceremony or martial arts.
That's very true. So I think in Japan you see probably a very obvious and strong connotation or correlation between the local cultural practices and what have become Buddhist practices. So most of the offerings, the way things are offered, the manner in which things are arranged have a very strong Shinto influence and come directly from Japanese culture. And the way that they're arranged and presented in, for example, Chinese culture would look very different outwardly.
Definitely. So I think now that we're in the 21st century in the United States, a lot of these practices still exist, but even now I can already see some of them changing. For example, we no longer light our candles with other candles, we light them with lighters.
That's true, yeah. It is much easier to use a lighter. So here at Temple in Portland, we use a lighter. And when I'm in Japan, sometimes we use a stick of incense. But it can often be a little bit precarious, so the lighter's a little safer for that purpose. Some of the other, big, if people are familiar with the lantern floating festival in Hawaii that happens around Memorial Day, that is a Buddhist service that was traditionally done that's now been adopted to, almost the entire state is televised, in fact, and has, I think, probably even transcended the original Buddhist purpose and become just something that is part of the culture of all people in Hawaii, and people of all religions take part in that practice.
So I think there's definitely a lot of room historically and even now for Buddhist practices to evolve and to take new form. But I think ultimately there's always this core to the reason why these Buddhist practices exist. And that sort of core, what would you describe that as?
I think the core is just responding to the needs of the people. So probably the biggest service that's common in all of the traditions that have their origin in Chinese culture. So most of the things you would see in China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan have a very strong connection with memorial services. So I think this aspect tends to be probably the thing that I find that people new to Buddhism are most, shocked by. I guess I'll use that word. They're often very shocked. And in early academic works, it was often termed as sort of ancestor worship Buddhism. But I think it's just a reflection of the needs of the people, that grief, the importance of family, wanting to do something for the deceased was the one of the strongest motivations for spiritual practice. And so the temples responded by having services for that. So that tends to be, for better or worse, at many temples, sometimes the majority of the practices, or what the monastics spend the majority of the time doing, depending on the needs of the local community. But I think it was something that has brought people back to the temples. It forms a very strong connection, and it serves a very important function within society. So the reason I think we don't see it so often in the West is that most Westerners who study Buddhism or practice Buddhism are doing it in isolation. So they're not involving their families. They're not bringing their spouse or children to the temple or meditation center. They usually have not been introduced to it by their parents or grandparents, as it would have normally been done in Asia. People usually have a familial connection. So they tend to have a much more individualistic perspective of the reason for their practice. So I think perhaps when we get to that point where Buddhism has become large enough, where it's a family-wide practice, you may see the same interest develop in memorial services. So in the state, for example, in Hawaii, which has a majority Asian population, Buddhism has been practiced by Americans for over 100 years in the Hawaiian Islands, and the memorial service is a strong part of those Buddhist traditions. And I find it interesting because other than that, the lives, TV programs, work environment, conversation, slang, music that's popular would be the same as that in the rest of North America, but the manner of Buddhist practice is very different from what you'll see in the rest of the country.
And I think another aspect of the evolution of Buddhist practice is going back to the Japanese practices of tea ceremony and whatnot. I think those are very much similar to a lot of the mindfulness practices now in the US. It's a different form, but I think ultimately the reason why they exist, sort of that active meditation component, is there and present in both styles.
I would agree. I think the tea ceremony especially had a strong impetus to develop and spread because you had a large population of samurai who didn't have many wars to prosecute in the country. So having a lot of idle warriors who were used to very rigorous practice, but then not having an outlet necessarily for their specific art, many of them channeled their art, their artistic expression away from the sword or the spear and into things like the brush and tea ceremony. So it became a more peaceful means of utilizing the same type of rigorous mental focus and concentration, but adapting it to something that you could do on a daily basis and then also share with people in a more peaceful manner. And then that was also, I think, the Buddhism's interplay with the martial arts throughout all of Asian history. You see sort of two streams. You see a practice stream that's focused on the development of the individual, and then you see a definitely an application stream, which unfortunately when those times are needed to defend oneself, the skills are still useful, but the majority of the time we do live in a peaceful manner, and finding a use for those practices, skills, coming from a battlefield art expression to more of how we see the martial arts practice today in most forms, which is a art of self-development.
Mm-hmm. So looking at this, I'm trying to think of, it reminds me of sort of a connection between this topic and something that we recently talked about in one of the Thursday night classes here in Portland, the idea of essence and function. So I think that there's always this essence of Buddhist practice of self-cultivation, of self-development, and to benefit self and other. But then the function or the manifestations of these are manifold. And I think we can't say that any practice is less than another, that they're all sort of these manifestations of the same essence and essential idea.
I would agree. I think especially, I think it's, so I don't want to hold one cultural expression of Buddhism over another, but I think you see it especially in the Japanese forms, art forms, and the connection with Buddhism is that a lot of things, the way things are done, the relationship between teacher and student, the manner in which people study, draws a lot of its essence from Buddhist practice and Buddhist monastic forms. So if people are looking for a good example, and if you happen to have Netflix, the movie that came out recently, Jiro Dreams of Sushi, if you look at the sushi chef's interaction with the students, the expectation that they will apprentice for at least 10 years before they move up to being a chef themselves, the requirement that the people learn every aspect of the kitchen, from the selection of the materials to how things are cut, the acceptance of the student to doing what may appear on the outside to be a lowly or menial job, but their gradual understanding of how important every step in the process is. I think a lot of that definitely is drawn from traditional Buddhist practice and monastic structure. So for myself, when I was in the monastery, my job was to scrub the floor, and you learn a lot by washing the floor, especially on your hands and knees. So people always laugh at me in this country when I don't use a mop. I find it cleaner to do it on the hands and knees, but you actually learn a lot. Your perspective is completely different. It's not often that we view the world from 2 to 3 feet off the ground, especially as adults. And we have a different connection. I often found, when the floorboards were loose before it was obvious, before it became a tripping hazard or something like that. But you also find a deeper connection with the wood and appreciation for, especially in the monastery, it was very nice wood floor, for the craftsmanship that went into it. So our perspective changed, our connection with the place of practice was different. Rather than just rushing in to do the practice, I had a deeper sense of appreciation for every aspect of my practice, including the floor under my feet. So I think that aspect has sort of percolated through a lot of Japanese arts, be it pottery, almost any traditional art. There's a lot of focus on not only what you're learning, but the manner in which you learn, and also the manner in which you interact with the teacher. And that creates an appreciation for the learning that is probably just as important as what you learn.
Mm-hmm. And thinking back to my own time when I was studying at the monastery, a lot of my practice was in serving the community, so preparing water or tea for the elder monastics, or preparing their food. And I think since you brought up sushi chefs, I think cooking is very much a very good practice as well. There's a lot to be learned in not wasting anything. There's a lot to be learned in providing for the community and supporting them nutritionally, and putting all of that care and compassion into the cooking. But all of these practices, I thought, even though they weren't explicitly Buddhist, there wasn't any chanting going on necessarily. There wasn't formal sitting meditation associated with this. There was a lot to be learned, and there was a lot of growth in a Buddhist sense, just through everyday things.
I would agree. I often get asked, people say, well, how many hours a day did you meditate in the monastery? And I'd say, actually, other than the morning service, I spent most of the time cleaning or working. And people are surprised by that. But I think we're encouraged to find the meaning from our study in our daily life through those types of practices, rather than only having that sort of introspection on the meditation cushion or during morning chanting. And since you bring up cooking, that was actually a major teaching tool of my teacher. So he would have teaching cooking classes, and one of the experiments he would do is give everyone the exact same ingredients and the same recipe, and then have them cook their own dish. So everyone would be chatting or not chatting, but working together in the kitchen, cutting the vegetables and preparing the dish. And thankfully there we actually had several stoves, so everyone could then cook their dish. And then afterwards we would all sit and eat together and taste each other's dishes. And surprisingly, even though we all had the same ingredients, the same pans, even the same 5 or 6 identical stoves, they all tasted differently. And so the flavor was slightly different. And he would always use that opportunity to show how, what we thought, how we acted, how we set our mind during the practice changed the outcome. And it was a really good lesson. There was always a lot of stunned silence afterwards, like, oh, why does it taste different? But it was also enjoyable. So people not only learned to cook, of course, healthy vegetarian food, but also learned a lot about themselves. And probably most notable the first time I did it was how much my mind wavered, how much, when I looked at the resulting cut vegetables, they were different sizes because I was too busy looking at the person next to me and not focusing on the task at hand. So it ended up being a really good teaching tool.
Yeah. And I think going back to sort of the main idea of this topic, the evolution of Buddhist practices, bringing that into the modern day, I think Buddhist practice is very accessible. I think it can be accessed in anybody's life, in anything really that we do, as long as we have that sort of mindset to practice. Because I think we can cook and just cook, but we can also cook and turn it into a practice in itself.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think there is some effort to do this. The ever widening mindfulness movement tends to try to bring mindfulness to every possible aspect of life, including even mindfulness practices within the military, with teachers, with students, with people who are in prison, to a variety of different places. And I think in general that's good. I think what a lot of those practices are missing, though, are maybe a spirit of self-cultivation rather than just taking concentration and sort of overlaying this label of mindfulness on it. So a lot of the practices are not necessarily conducive to learning or self-cultivation. Sometimes they're just good at making a bad habit better. So I think we have to look a little bit at what the practice is, but that spirit of the practice, that kind of deeper purpose behind something that may look mundane, can be adapted to nearly anything. When I was in school, I met a person who was teaching a Japanese form of studying, and they called it clear desk, clear mind. And the idea was that if you actually take the space in which you study and keep it very clean, but you remove everything other than the actual material you're studying, that you will help your focus. So I realized right away that this was right from a Buddhist temple. So he tended not to have extraneous items in the actual practice space. So you wouldn't bring a cup of tea to your morning chanting. That would be for after. But if we look at our workspaces, they tend to be very cluttered. And then we find that our mind wanders, or we might play around on the internet, or we'll do something else because we have these distractions. So it was a very simple method, but one that I saw immediately, that connection, just maybe having the book and the pad of paper that you're taking notes on, and remove any stickers or posters or anything else from the area. It seemed very austere, but it ended up being very efficient. I found that studying that environment ended up being easier than it had been before, even though before I thought, I've made it very cozy and it's very comfortable. Then it ended up being just a good place to take a nap rather than get work done.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I know when I'm studying, if I have my phone next to me, every time it beeps or vibrates, I check it. And at the end of the study session, I think about it, and I have probably spent a good 15 minutes looking at the updates on my phone.
Right.
And it really starts to cut into any studying time or work time that I could be using to get everything done, and then worry about all of the notifications later. Because usually it's someone liked my photo, someone commented on my status, and this person uploaded a new video on YouTube. So all of those can wait.
I would agree. I think obviously at morning meditation or morning service, cell phones are not taken in. But we probably also have lost sight of how many more distractions there are now than there were prior. When I was your age in undergrad, we didn't have so many. Well, no one had cell phone that I know. So we didn't have that distraction. So if you went to the library and found a quiet corner to meditate, to study. Oh, I was meditating sometimes, but a quiet place to study. Then it was a good distraction-free place, and oftentimes that's what the main impetus to go to the library was, to escape any interruption. But now we tend to take interruptions with us. So I think a good takeaway for how do you take this idea and integrate it to your life is just try to reduce some of the distractions at some point during the day. It's not completely possible to turn off the phone all the time, or take ourselves away from distractions all the time. But as I often challenge people, turn the phone off for a little while, or the next time you're driving, and try not to listen to the radio. Try to spend a little bit of time without the background noise or without the distraction, and just see what's really going on with your mind, or where your thoughts take you at that point. So we're often spending a lot of time just running away from our thinking, and as you mentioned earlier, practices like tea ceremony or martial arts are designed to bring us into the present moment, to sort of keenly focus our attention on one thing, the person making the tea, the experience of drinking the tea. If you're doing martial arts practice, to be completely focused on the form you may be learning or performing. Especially, I know when I was practicing martial arts, as soon as you do a weapons form, for example, doing Iaido in college, as soon as you put a sword in your hand with a sharp blade, you can't help but be very focused and mindful. There's no room for the mind to waver, to drift, or to daydream, because the result could be catastrophic. So those are actually all good practices for finding real concentration and using, I think, this kind of background Buddhist concept and adapting it to a variety of actual practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sort of as a side note, I was thinking about the idea of mindfulness and the practice of that and how it's portrayed in modern day America. And something I see it connotated with is doing things slower. And while I think that's partly true, at least in my experience with the monastery, sometimes that's very true. We do take things a bit slower. But sometimes I was told, be mindful, but be fast.
Yes, yeah.
So mindful eating can be done slow, but sometimes your lunch is 10 minutes. Let's get over it and keep going.
Yes. If you're in Japan as a student, especially in Shingon tradition, Koya-san, part of your work is to prepare the room for guests who've come to stay at the temple and take their meals. So taking too long, of course, the food's cold by the time you get it to them, and they won't be happy. So you oftentimes are running, but you have to be very mindful in that process, because you're holding a large stack of trays and very easy to drop everything. And then, of course, having to open the paper sliding doors, which are delicate, and kneel down and place the trays requires a lot of balance and skill, but yes, there's a lot of running. A lot of running. So I think there's a lot of Buddhist practice generally that, as I often say, I wish people in the West would steal from Buddhism. I think it would be helpful. And as I mentioned earlier, one of those is the memorial service. We all face grief. We all face the loss of people that are close to us at some point or another, whether that be human companions or four-leg companions. The memorial service can be a very helpful way of taking our Buddhist practice and adapting it very directly to those obstacles in our life. And I think it's something that would be very helpful for a lot of people in this country who, as I've observed sometimes, after maybe a week or two, people expect that we're done with our grief when someone passes away, or when our companion is no longer with us. And it often takes, years or decades for us to feel normal again after that. And I think it's entirely appropriate to bring the depth and breadth of Buddhist teaching to bear to help in those areas. So I think a good, I wish I could put it out as is very common in Portland, the free box at the corner. Take this practice and use it. I wish the memorial service was something that I would see done more often, offered more to people who are new to Buddhism, who are interested in meditation, because oftentimes grief and loss are the obstacles to our spiritual practice.
All right. Is there anything else that we should add before we wrap up today?
No, I just want to thank everybody who's been following the podcast and been patient with our technical difficulties. And again, as we mentioned at the beginning, if there's any topic that you'd like to hear explored, please leave a comment on our Facebook page or YouTube, or send an email, and we'll be happy to try to address that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Sensei.